I will take you out of the nations, I will gather you from all the countries, and bring you back into your own land. It seemed impossible. No nation in history had ever risen from the ashes before, but it was written, and it came true. A people, scattered like dust across the earth, persecuted and exiled for more than 2,000 years, finally returned to their promised land. Israel was reborn, and in doing so fulfilled a prophecy that had lain dormant for centuries. The vision of the valley of dry bones. But pay attention, the vision isn't finished yet. 2 of the 3 stages have already happened: the physical return and the political revival. But the final stage of the prophecy is yet to come. And when it does, it will shake the entire world. Because Israel isn't just another country. It's God's prophetic clock. And each event, each threat, each war takes us one step closer to the final countdown. Stay until the end, because Israel's destiny is written in the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones from beginning to end. And it's closer than you can imagine. To understand the mystery of the Valley of Dry Bones, we must go back more than 2,500 years to a time when Israel was no longer a free nation. It had been conquered, divided, and exiled. The 10 northern tribes had been destroyed by Assyria more than a century earlier. And now only Judah remained, weakened and divided. It was the age of Israel's final kings, weak rulers like Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, who reigned amid corruption, idolatry, and the threat of surrounding empires. The temple still stood, yet it was no longer sacred. It had become defiled by idols, its justice replaced by greed. And in the year 597 BC, just as the prophet Jeremiah had warned, judgment came. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded Jerusalem for the second time. This time he did not destroy the city, but he took thousands into exile, including nobles, craftsmen, soldiers, and a young priest named Ezekiel, who was only 25. Ezekiel came from a priestly family. He had been destined to serve in the temple and, according to the law of Moses, to begin his priestly ministry at age 30, but his priesthood never came as exile snatched him away first. He was taken to Tel Aviv, a settlement of exiles located on the banks of the Kabar River, a canal in Babylon. There a marginalized Jewish community lived, separated from the temple and distant from God. For 5 long years Ezekiel lived among the deportees, silently watching as his people repeated their mistakes. Even in this foreign land, many wondered whether God had abandoned them completely. Some still clung to the hope that their punishment was temporary, that Jerusalem would endure, and someday they would return to the promised land. But others had lost hope entirely, surrendering themselves fully to Babylon's culture. Israel had not merely lost a battle. It had lost its purpose, had betrayed the covenant, and worst of all, they had lost their faith. Ezekiel found himself caught between 2 worlds, one of promise and one of judgment. He had prepared all his life to serve God, yet all he faced now was a shattered people living in a foreign land. It was precisely when Ezekiel turned 30, the exact age when he would have begun his priesthood, that God finally spoke. Suddenly the heavens opened up and a storm appeared with flashes of lightning and a dense blazing cloud, and within it were the cherubim of God. There were 4 living creatures, each with 4 faces: human, lion, ox, and eagle. Their wings stretched out, their feet gleamed like burnished bronze, and beside them wheels moved. Wheels within wheels, covered with eyes, moving without turning. It was a vision impossible to describe. Ezekiel understood what he was witnessing: the glory of God lifting, leaving the temple, abandoning Jerusalem. And there in enemy territory, in the midst of exile, God said to him, "Son of man, stand up on your feet, and I will speak to you." Ezekiel fell to the ground, overwhelmed with fear. But then God handed him a scroll, saying, "Eat this scroll, and then speak to the house of Israel." The scroll was filled front and back with words of sorrow and grief. Ezekiel ate it, and although it contained judgment, it tasted sweet as honey in his mouth. From that moment onward, Ezekiel became a prophet. God made him a watchman, a lookout. Among ruins, someone who had to warn, to cry out, to act even though no one wanted to listen. And the hardest part, God told him the people wouldn't listen, for their hearts were hardened. So he would speak with his body. ****. Thus began the strangest and most symbolic mission of all the prophets. Ezekiel would preach with his body. God commanded him to perform symbolic acts portraying the judgment that was soon to come. Ezekiel had to lie down on his side for 390 days, each day representing 1 year of Israel's sin, and then lie another 40 days for Judah. He was to eat measured bread baked over dung as fuel, as a vivid sign of the famine soon to grip Jerusalem. Then, he was instructed to shave his head with a sword and divide the hair into 3 parts, burning one portion, cutting another with the sword, and scattering the last portion into the wind. Thus would Jerusalem's people perish, by fire, by sword, and by scattering. But then came the hardest part. God announced to him, "The delight of your eyes will die, and you shall not mourn." And so it happened. Ezekiel's wife died, but he was forbidden to mourn. For this was how Jerusalem's fall would be. So sudden, so merciless that there would be no time even to mourn. Ezekiel lost everything. His home, his temple, and even his beloved wife. Yet in exchange, God granted him a revelation. The fate of Israel unveiled in the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones. Ezekiel had witnessed impossible things before, but nothing prepared him for this prophetic roadmap of Israel's destiny, its destruction, its rebirth, and finally its restoration in the last days. It all began when the hand of the Lord came upon Ezekiel, and in the spirit he was carried away to a desolate place. It was a valley, vast, silent, dry. But the most chilling part wasn't the landscape itself. It was what covered the ground. Bones, countless dry bones scattered randomly across the parched earth, fractured and abandoned long ago. Ezekiel was led to walk among the lifeless remains, feeling the brittle crunch beneath his feet as he stepped on bones bleached by sun and worn by time. The scene made sense immediately. The valley represented Israel, destroyed, exiled, landless, abandoned, a nation reduced to dust. But then amid the deafening silence, God presented Ezekiel with a troubling question. "Son of man, can these bones live again?" Ezekiel looked around at the landscape, utterly lifeless and forsaken. The question carried tension, for logic said no. Yet Ezekiel knew the Lord could do the impossible. Humbly he answered, "Lord, only you know." Then God did something unimaginable. He challenged Ezekiel to preach to the bones. "Prophesy to these bones and say to them, 'Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord." It seemed absurd. Yet Ezekiel had faith and obeyed. He stood facing that sea of death. And as he began to speak, the ground started shaking. At first there was a faint sound like an underground rumbling, but it quickly grew into a mighty roar that echoed throughout the valley. The sound shook the bones, and they began to move and reconnect, seeking each other out, matching bone to bone, perfectly aligned. Spine joined to vertebrae, femur to hips, ribs and skulls, all fitting into place. Then tendons appeared. Flesh covered the structure of bones and skin wrapped around the bodies. A scattered army began to reconstruct itself right before his eyes. And in moments what had once been a field of death became a valley overflowing with complete human bodies. Yet they had no life. No breath flowed in them, and they stood motionless. They bore human shape but remained corpses. Then God spoke again, commanding Ezekiel to do something even deeper. not to prophesy to the bodies, but instead speak directly to the spirit, the breath itself. Prophesy, Son of Man, and say to the breath, Thus says the Lord God, breath, come forth from the four winds. Breathe upon these slain so they may live. Ezekiel obeyed again, and as he uttered these words, the wind came, unseen but profoundly real. This was not ordinary air. It was Ruach, the very breath of God descending on them. The same breath that filled Adam at creation, the same breath. That transformed clay into a living being. And then it happened. Bodies began to breathe. Their chests expanded and life returned to them. Before Ezekiel stood an army, a living symbol of Israel's rebirth, a people who had been dead, but whom God raised back to life. This vision of the Valley of Bones is so crucial that God did not leave its explanation up to interpretation. Lord made its meaning clear in these 4 verses. Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, Our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, This is what the sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord. These 4 verses reveal Israel's past, its present, and its future. The first thing we must understand is that Ezekiel was taken to the valley to see the spiritual and prophetic reality of his people. The valley represents exile, but also spiritual descent. In the Bible, valleys are places of trials, representing judgment and death. Israel had literally descended from its holy mountain Zion down into the land of dust, and what Ezekiel saw, there were not living bodies. The dry bones symbolize a collective death as a nation. It is the vision of a people erased from existence, silenced by history. God was referring to his people Israel, and Israel scattered for centuries without temple, territory, king, or even a shared language. God called the nations into which Israel was scattered graves, and Israel transformed for 2,000 years into a wandering people, enduring inquisitions, expulsions, and the Holocaust. God's question, will these bones live, wasn't a test for Ezekiel, but for his people. For God acts when everything is dead and nothing remains. Yet God's promise was clear. He would raise them from the dead. And he spelled out prophetically the order in which their restoration would unfold. First there comes a trembling sound, then bones join together, and after that muscles and flesh appear, but still without breath. This symbolizes the first stage in Israel's restoration, a physical return, a territorial homecoming. For nearly 2,000 years, Ezekiel's prophecy seemed impossible to fulfill. In the year 70 AD, the Roman armies destroyed Jerusalem and set fire to the Second Temple. Israel ceased to exist as a nation. The Jewish people scattered, first by the Roman Empire and later throughout Europe, North Africa, Asia, and the Americas. They lived as foreigners, frequently rejected, persecuted, and forced to hide their faith. This catastrophe sealed ancient Israel's fate, scattering its people into a worldwide diaspora that would last centuries, turning the Jews into strangers in every land. Without a temple, without a homeland, they clung only to a promise. The ancient words written by their prophets, because centuries earlier, God had already warned through Moses that this would happen. And the Lord will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other. And among these nations you will find no peace, nor will you have a place to rest the sole of your foot. And though their identity seemed to fade, it never vanished completely. The people of Israel preserved their language, their faith, their heritage, and their hope of return. Every year, each Passover celebrated in exile, they repeated a phrase that seemed impossible: next year in Jerusalem. That yearning was what kept the promise alive. because what seemed impossible had been written centuries before. The people who had been scattered like dust would return. The land that had been left desolate would bloom, and the name that had been forgotten would again be proclaimed among the nations, Israel. And that day finally arrived. On May 14, 1948, after the horrors of the Holocaust, David Ben-Gurion stood up in Tel Aviv and declared something many had believed would never come true. The State of Israel is born. The nation of Israel, absent for 2,000 years, sprang back to life. This event had no precedent in human history. For the first time in millennia, the Jewish people returned to their ancestral home to establish the State of Israel. Dry bones began to reconnect. Their people came home to the Promised Land. Yet most striking of all, Ezekiel's ancient prophecy had just begun to unfold. For God had not simply said, "I will restore Jerusalem," or "I will rebuild the temple." The Lord had declared, "I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land." Within just a few years, millions of Jewish people returned from over 100 different countries, from the United States, Ethiopia, Russia, Argentina, Germany. People who spoke different languages and had never set foot in Jerusalem returned, and the bones began joining together again. Many theologians, scholars, and believers see this event as the literal beginning of the fulfillment of Ezekiel 37. Since that time, Israel has been attacked, surrounded by enemies, threatened every decade, but still it remains. And not only does it remain, it thrives. In 1948, it was a desert. Today it exports technology, water, fruits, intelligence, and security. Hebrew, once a dead language for centuries, is now spoken by millions of people. The same language the prophets used to write God's word. This isn't only a language. It's a living testimony that what was once dead can come back to life. Isaiah's prophecies have also come true. The wilderness will blossom like the lily. But Ezekiel foresaw 3 stages: the gathering of the bones, the rebuilding of the body, and the entering of the Spirit. Israel has already fulfilled 2 of these 3 stages. First was the physical return. Then came the flesh, the political reconstruction. But it still has not received the breath of God, the spiritual restoration. Israel has not yet been transformed by the Spirit, because the majority of the nation still does not recognize the Messiah. Many live by faith, others without it. But the great promise prophesied long ago, an outpouring of the Spirit, a collective inner transformation, has yet to take place. At the first Pentecost, the Holy Spirit descended upon a group of disciples in Jerusalem and changed history forever. But the prophet spoke of another Pentecost, one not limited to a few but extending to the entire nation. When that day comes, it will be like fire spreading across the globe, a breath of life reawakening dry bones. When Ezekiel prophesies, he uses the Hebrew word ruach, meaning the breath of God. This detail is crucial because it signifies that the Spirit of God will once again dwell among His people. And this still has not been fulfilled. Israel is gathered in its homeland. The valley is no longer empty. Yet the breath of God has not descended upon them. And so the question remains, when will Israel breathe again? When will they receive the divine breath that renews their hearts and fulfills the prophetic vision? To find this answer, we must look beyond Ezekiel. He wasn't the only one who foresaw it. This promise echoed throughout all of the prophets. Jeremiah spoke it with clear prophetic certainty centuries earlier. "I will put my law within them and write it upon their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." Joel, his part, announced something radical. "I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your elders will dream dreams." Zechariah, perhaps the most vivid of all prophets, spoke of a future day when the people of Israel would behold the Messiah, and their hearts would break. "I will pour out upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit O of grace and supplication. They will look upon me whom they have pierced. Centuries later, the Apostle Paul dedicated 3 entire chapters in his letter to the Romans to explaining this mystery, clearly stating, partial blindness has come upon Israel until the full number of Gentiles has come in, and then all Israel will be saved. Asterisk, here lies the key. Today Israel has returned to her land. The bones have come together, and flesh has been restored. But the breath of God, the Ruach, has yet to descend. That will be the final miracle. And it won't be symbolic. It will be very real. A national awakening that will change history and usher in the final stage of the prophetic plan. In this future spiritual awakening, God will restore not only the hearts of Israel, but also seal a remnant for a sacred mission. The book of Revelation 7 reveals a crucial detail about the end times. God will choose 144,000 servants from among the 12 tribes of Israel, marking them with his seal to fulfill a prophetic mission during the judgments of the last days. We read, "And I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 sealed from all the tribes of the sons of Israel." This is not just an arbitrary symbolic number. Revelation specifies 12,000 people selected from each tribe, representing a faithful, consecrated remnant who will bring light to the coming darkness. These sealed ones are actual Israelites chosen by God to proclaim his truth when the world falls into chaos and confusion. As trumpets sound, as seals are broken, and as humanity experiences the pains of the final judgment, these 144,000 will stand as messengers of the gospel, proclaiming Christ as the true Messiah, not just to Israel, but to all nations. Asterisk, asterisk. This is the ultimate confirmation that even in the midst of tribulation, God has not forgotten his people. He will use them as instruments of global salvation, because Israel's purpose isn't fulfilled merely by returning to their land, but by returning to the heart of God and finally becoming what they've always been called to be, a light to the nations. Jesus clearly said, "Learn the lesson from the fig tree. When its branches grow tender and its leaves sprout, you know that summer is near." Israel is that fig tree. And the prophetic clock began ticking when its leaves sprouted in 1948. But there's more. Israel hasn't just returned to its land. It has become once again the center of conflict, the epicenter of global attention. Every war, every tension around Jerusalem is closely watched by nations worldwide, because what happens with Israel affects the entire globe. And even that was foretold. "Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup that causes trembling among all the surrounding peoples." Ezekiel's vision is still unfolding today. The nation has returned. The valley is no longer empty, but the Spirit of God has yet to dwell within his people. The Valley of Dry Bones is a prophetic roadmap, a timeline for Israel's restoration. However, this was not the end. Immediately afterward, Ezekiel received another revelation, and this time it isn't about restoration. It's about war. A prophetic war. Right after Israel's rebirth as a nation, the prophet sees a terrifying vision directly connected to the end of times. A mysterious leader named Gog, prince of the land of Magog, arises commanding a coalition of foreign nations to launch an attack against Israel. Not an ancient Israel, but a restored Israel dwelling safely in its land without walls or fortifications. The names listed in this alliance are not symbolic. They're real nations today. Persia, now Iran. Cush, now Sudan, Put, now Libya. Gomer and Togarmah, now Turkey. All these nations converge from the north, south and east toward a single target on the map, Jerusalem. Yet Ezekiel doesn't depict this merely as an invasion. He calls it a divine appointment. For God himself declares, "I will put hooks into your jaws and bring you up against my land, so that the nations may know me." In other words, God will allow this attack in order to reveal himself, It won't be geopolitical warfare. It will be an act of judgment. Ezekiel tells us that when Gog and his allies are about to strike, a powerful earthquake will occur. Mountains will crumble, soldiers will turn against one another, and fire and brimstone will rain down from heaven. Israel, however, will not defend itself. God himself will. Thus I will magnify and sanctify myself, and the nations will know that I am the Lord. But Ezekiel wasn't the only one who saw this war. Centuries later, the prophet Zechariah described it from a different angle. The nations will gather together to attack Jerusalem. The city will be divided, houses plundered. Then at that very moment, the Lord himself will descend and fight, just as he did in ancient days. And it says even more, on that day his feet will stand firmly on the Mount of Olives. Who was Zechariah referring to? The Messiah, the very one who was rejected, pierced, and crucified, but who returns now as king. And in Revelation 20, written by the Apostle John over 600 years later, the enemy surfaces again bearing the same name, Gog and Magog. The nations will rebel one last time, surround the camp of the saints, and once more attempt to destroy God's people. But there will be no battle. God's fire will fall in judgment, consuming them. God's plan doesn't change. Israel remains at the very center stage of its ultimate fulfillment. Because Israel is more than simply land. It's the stage upon which God's great plan began, and where it will reach its ultimate climax. Israel's scattering was prophesied. Her return was prophesied. Even her hardening and eventual awakening, all predicted ahead of time. And in the final battle, when every nation rises up against Jerusalem, God himself will respond in mighty power. Israel is God's prophetic clock. It was there the Messiah was rejected. There he was raised up on a cross, and there he will return as king. Every event, every threat, every war marks another step toward fulfilling what is written. Revelation confirms it. Jerusalem will be the target, but it will also become the place of final redemption. Paul, Peter, John, Ezekiel, Zechariah all agree the Messiah will return there. And when God's people came back to their land and Jerusalem again became their capital, the prophetic calendar was set in motion. That's why, as nations began aligning against Israel, the echoes of the end became impossible to ignore. Because everything written is about to come to pass. And the place where history began will be the very same place where eternity begins. Jesus said it clearly. When you see these things starting to happen, stand up and lift your heads, because your redemption draws near. Today, many prophecies, once considered impossible, are unfolding before our eyes. The return of the Jewish people to their homeland, the revival of Hebrew as a national language, the spiritual restoration of Jerusalem, and enemy alliances arising against Israel. Do you really think all of this is just coincidence? It's not. The Bible isn't some old book. It's a map, a clock, a warning, and a promise. Every fulfilled prophecy is one more tick in the final countdown. But the story is not over yet. We still await the most important event, the breath of the Spirit. And when that happens, it will spread across the world like fire. It will mark the beginning of the end, or perhaps the start of something new. Now, after everything you've heard, and after witnessing how an ancient vision was fulfilled word for word, the question is for you. Do you believe we're watching the final pages of God's plan unfold? Which side will you choose? Leave your thoughts in the comment box below, because the final pages are open and each of us must decide which side of history we want to be on. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel to keep understanding how current events are lining up perfectly with biblical prophecy. And if you haven't seen it yet, you really need to check out this video. It answers a question that few dare to ask openly. Is Israel still God's chosen people? Watch it now to understand who the people of Israel truly are today and whether they still remain God's chosen. God bless.